Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm so glad to be back. I have a wonderful guest planned for today. It's going to be an interesting conversation, and I think you'll really enjoy it. And of course, some housekeeping for the episode. If you have questions or comments, please email me at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. If you want to continue the discussions about the podcast, join me on social media on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook under A Date with Darkness. If you are looking for support from narcissistic abuse or any other type of abusive relationship, join my free Facebook group, A Date with Darkness Facebook group. All of the links that I've mentioned are below in the show notes. So please make sure that you take a look at that. And, if you're on iTunes, be sure to follow the podcast in order to be updated when new episodes drop. So it's not enough to just subscribe. You have to also follow, from what I understand. And please be sure to share and leave a good review for the podcast if you find the information on this podcast helpful. Leaving a positive review can help others, such as yourself, find this podcast and want to give it a listen and be beneficial to them too. So thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. For today's episode, I decided to interview a therapist who I've connected with on Instagram, Miss Yolanda Renteria. And she is a wonderful therapist, and she has a lot of great messages on Instagram, and I'll link her information down in the show notes as well, as she'll go over that as well. But on our discussion panel today, she and I talk about the evolution of abuse, the biological, environmental, and communal impacts on abuse, and why abuse isn't something so simple like just walking out of a relationship or just putting a stop to it, and why it continues. So, she goes into some genetic stuff and in the beginning, which I think is great. I love it. And I think it's such a refreshing conversation to have. But if you have some trouble understanding it in the beginning, just kind of the scientific stuff, be sure to stay tuned in, because she does a really great job of breaking it down. And I think that you will find it helpful. Hello and welcome to the show, Yolanda.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me here.
Great. I am doing great. And I'm so excited to have you on. It's been a long time in the making, us connecting. And I love what you do. But for my listeners who are not familiar with you and your work, tell us who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work.
Sure. So I am a licensed counselor, LPC. I have my master's in community counseling. I have my bachelor's in social work. I am also part of I'm adjunct faculty, so I teach psychology courses too. And I work full time at a community agency, and I work with predominantly Hispanic immigrant families and adults, mostly trauma, but I do a little bit of everything. I've worked with different client populations. Right now, I'm focusing my work with adults, and I have specific training in trauma.
Nice, nice. And you and I connected via Instagram, and you write about a lot of things that are related to, you know, Latina, African American, BIPOC, people of color issues, and also emotional relations, intergenerational trauma, emotionally connecting with parents and things like that. So you have a really big and lovely Instagram account. Can you talk a little bit about why these topics? Where does your motivation come from with these topics?
Mhm. Yes, well, I think I started my Instagram account just, I think as a lot of us start, just wanting to provide information. I really didn't know what to write about, but I think that as I kept writing and as I kept working with people and specializing in trauma, it became very clear to me that who we are, that the way that we function as adults is not just by chance. And
Mm,
so the more that I read, the more that I understand, um, and the more that I've done my own work, I realize that a lot of the programming that we have can actually be worked through, which is the biggest part. I think a lot of the times when people hear about just like talking about childhood experiences, like it might turn some people off saying like, well, that's in the past, it doesn't matter anymore. But I think that past is very much the present. And if we're not aware of it, we're just going to be repeating the same cycles. And so I think that's the passion behind my work and really trying to shed understanding, hopefully with my posts, so that people can make connections of how the things that happened in the past actually impacted the way they're showing up in their life right now.
that's lovely, and I think you put it so eloquently. One of the things that I would like to talk to you is just about just that very thing. Can you talk a little bit about why childhood trauma or the past, as you say, keeps showing up if we don't do the work?
Yes. So I give a lot of psychoeducation around this because I think it's so nuanced, but I'm gonna try to do my best to put it in a, summarize it. But the best way that I can describe it is that before we're even born, we are being like our brain is wiring. And the main focus of our body is to keep us alive because nothing matters if we're not alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our body wires for survival over everything. So
Mm,
if in order to ensure your survival, your body will do whatever it takes. The next thing is it wires to avoid pain, and threat. Like, so if there's anything that seems threatening to your nervous system, to your body, it sends that signal, and your survival mechanism activates to protect you. And I don't think that a lot of us realize how sophisticated this mechanism is, because our body's actually scanning our environment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to ensure that we're safe. And the way that it matches this uh, scanning that it's doing of our environment is by matching it with whatever has been wired in our system from the beginning of our life. So from the age of 0 to 6, about 90% of our brain is wired. And with that is like literally like our life experiences and based on our perception, right? Which obviously intergenerational trauma, epigenetics, um, personality traits or genetic traits factor into this.
mm-hmm.
That is what determines what will feel safe for us and when our protective mechanism is triggered. And this system is built in from a very young age because our body is literally wiring us in a way that it's ensuring that we're safe and protected in our environment, right? And based on this like wiring and system. And I don't know if that was like confusing because I'm trying to like picture it and explain it at the same time. But this is a system that we carry. This is a system that it's ingrained in us. This is a system, this is how we're wired. And so our body assumes that this is our life and this is the coping mechanisms that we have to deal with our environment are the ones that we will use for a lifetime. And if we don't work on reversing these are the ones that stay pretty permanent, right? Because your body always thinks like, this is your environment, this is how you grew up, this is how life is for you, right? So then I'm going to give you this protective mechanism for the environment that you're growing up in to keep you safe and protected. And until we realize that this is no longer necessary for us, then we're just repeating the same patterns.
Wow. So your body, just to, say that in a way, it sounds like from what you're saying, your body, your brain is wired right from the very, very beginning for survival, basic survival instincts, and to avoid pain. And so your body operates in that way, and so your brain is kind of laying down the hard work. And part of that is, I guess, learned from the environment that you're raised in, right? And so you learn what pain is and what survival is, or an extra layer, I should say, of what it is by growing up in a home environment. And if your home environment is super chaotic or super traumatic, your body is programming itself, or your brain is programming your body, rather, in the best way that it can to protect itself from all of those infractions. So it's really trying to save you.
Absolutely. And this system is so automatic, right? That a lot of the times we don't know it's happening. One of the things that I always tell people when they come in my office and I'm explaining these concepts, I say, like, you have a set of experiences that you've lived through. And those experiences and your temperament and your genes, right, make up this protective mechanism. This protective mechanism is very unique to you. And it's different than mine because we have not lived the same experiences. And we don't have the same temperature. We don't have the same genes. So when you come into this room, right, like into my office, without your awareness, your body is already scanning for safety. This is what your body is doing all the time, right? And how is it scanning for safety? Through your senses.
Yes.
Right? So what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're feeling, your sense, like we often don't talk about the sixth sense, like just that sense of like knowing, or this the felt sense. And as that is happening, your body is matching what is happening on the outside to your internal experiences. And a lot of people don't know that we store memories in our heart and our stomach, not just our brain, right? So what happens is that as that information is coming in through our senses, it matches it with our internal system. And based on that, it determines whether what you're experiencing right now is safe or not. And if there is something in your programming that determines that what you're experiencing right now is not safe, it will give you an automatic, like it will unleash like a memory, whether that's an emotional memory or a visual memory, and then you will get those automatic reactions that I think a lot of people don't like,
Mhm.
especially when we don't understand them, right? But sometimes people might feel like, I this doesn't feel comfortable, I just want to leave, or I just like got annoyed by, I don't know, the setting of the room, or by whatever my therapist is wearing, right?
Mhm.
So that matching, like your system is basically doing the work for you to ensure that you're safe in that space. And sometimes even when we logically think that there's nothing safe, our body actually is giving us memories that there was something that might have been unpleasant, uncomfortable, or unsafe.
That makes a lot of sense. And you reminded me of something. I remember when I was in grad school, and back when I was in my master's program, I believe it was in Chicago. y- Back then it was like, oh, they were really starting to use that multicultural programming. And that was the buzzword. I don't know if they got funding for that or what, but that seemed to be the buzzword. It seemed to be the politically correct word, that they were doing multicultural appropriate programming and this and that, and they really prided themselves on that. And I remember when I went to class, there was only a couple of us Black students in class, majority white, but a couple of us. And I know that, in our class, one of the girls spoke up and she said, as soon as I come into a room, I'm scanning to see for the other Black people in the room. And she's like, because I know that when I come in a room in the school, it's going to be the majority of white students. And she was saying that when I'm in a majority white space, I'm always looking for the other Black person or the closest person that I can identify, because I automatically feel like it's us against them.
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, that's a unique perspective, because even me being Black or what have you, I never thought about that. But I've always sat in the front of the room because I have a hearing disability. So I am always in this, again, I have to sit automatically where I'm able to hear and tell what's going on. So it's different types of safety, but it makes sense that it's stored in your stomach, your heart, because that's our fight or flight mechanisms, right? Where we learn to run or we learn to get up and fight, and a lot of that information is stored in the gut.
Mhm. Mhm.
So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I love that you share that, because I think that oftentimes we think about pain as in physical pain, but there
Mm,
are so many ways to feel pain, and there are so many ways to feel unsafe, right?
mm,
As you said that, like I automatically thought, it makes sense when you're scanning for somebody who looks like you, because that is a source of safety, right? Like I'm not alone. I'm not I don't have to go through this alone.
mhm,
The other thing is when you mention like being in front of the room, like the body automatically wants to avoid pain. And what if we think about it, like you're not suffering like from physical pain from not hearing, but still there is that um painful experience of being in a place where things are not accessible to you, and you have to go through more like difficult experiences,
mm,
and your body will want to avoid that. And sometimes it will be for people who are disabled in general, a lot of it we hear that not having accessibility, right, can
mhm.
be in reality painful,
Yes.
because you're having to struggle so much just to be able to have the same access as other people have just regularly, because the world fits, is molded to
Yes.
fit their needs.
Yes. And so, yeah, I definitely, I find that very relatable in a way. And, part of what I'm wondering, from your experience, do you see, do you think that people of color have more of this inner biological workings? Like, do you think that's at a heightened state? And, because we might can't get into all of it, all of the biological or medical stuff for sure. And I'm certainly not trying to go there. But as you're talking, and the reason why I'm asking this question, I should say, is because I notice that oftentimes people of color will have, are more likely to have issues with blood pressure, stomach issues, or issues related to food processing things within the stomach, kidney issues, all of those things, all of those important organs that are involved in what you're talking about in terms of the biological workings. And so I guess my question is, just do you feel like we have more of that, or um, is it heightened or more so than other populations, or do you think it's sustained over a much longer period of time, or maybe a combination?
think we can have this conversation for honestly like hours. I find this so interesting
Yeah.
because like we cannot deny that our history plays a big role into who we
Yes.
are. I think that oftentimes we really want to separate ourselves from everything, right? And say
Mm-hmm.
like nothing, like I make my choices and I'm responsible for what happens to me and all of this. And I'm not discrediting that, right? I feel like there's a space and a place for that. But I also think that it's so important to understand how we function and how our genes play a big role in this,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it was Diane Poole Heller, a friend shared a quote from one of her trainings, and she said like, where she asked the question, where does your mom's trauma live in your body?
Mm.
And
Mm.
the rationale behind that question
Mm-hmm.
is that we carry at least 3 generations of experiences before us in our body.
Mm.
We are the result of how we were parented. And we also are the result of how our parents were, the parenting that they received. And
Mm.
they, so it's a chain. And so I've heard this in multiple times that it's at least 3 generations before us impacted who we are now. Now, the way that I like to explain this, or the way that I managed to understand it, is that our body, again, if we understand it as the sort that we have this protective mechanism that always wants to keep us safe, if it wired our ancestors for survival, right? And if we just try to begin to imagine what their environment is like,
Oh gosh, yeah.
then we can start to understand what their survival mechanism looked like,
Mm.
right? Because in order for our ancestor to be able to survive what they did, they had to have these protective mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of us right now understand as like anxiety, right? But what is anxiety? It's constantly feeling on edge, feeling constantly scanning your environment. Your fight flight response is on constantly. That's anxiety. It's fear. When we really think about anxiety, is we're afraid that something is going to happen, and that was the reality for a lot of people, for a lot of our ancestors.
Yes.
That's the way that they live. So the way that epigenetics the way that I understand, I would say, because I'm not a science is not, I'm not in that field, but the way that I understand epigenetics is that if my parents had to activate that survival mechanism of always looking around, being cautious, telling me to be quiet, because my survival literally depended on being nice, being compliant, not, like not making fuss. Literally, I think like when people understand the history, they will understand that a lot of these things would have meant really bad things for people and for children if they didn't comply, if they didn't please others, if they didn't just work to ensure that other people's needs were met and not their own, right? So then the what happens with epigenetics is that there's this belief that because you are in that environment, you're more likely to have children who are also born in that environment. So what happens in the genes that we have our DNA, or DNA is not modified, but we have now these genetic, like these tags that attach to our DNA. And these tags are genetic adaptations.
For survival.
So children are now born with those genetic adaptations, which if you think about it, it's genius. Because if your parents lived in an abusive environment, and I know that I'm talking about ancestors right now, but just in general, like domestic violence, right?
Yes.
Poverty.
Yes.
Genocide. I mean, there's just so many.
Yeah.
And now you're born in a similar environment. It's genius that your body is adapting to it before you even take your first breath, right? So now you have these genetic adaptations. You're in the same environment, those adaptations turn on. But the same way that those adaptations turn on, we can turn them off, And this is where like breaking cycles is so important, and understanding the impact of what we're doing. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of the things that we do with children come from colonization. In our case, like, right, like in here in America, and for other people in different countries, that depending on the situation and what they've lived through, and even from what people are living through now, right? Like the crisis happening around the world now. We are centering survival above anything else. So connection, which is something that humans are meant to do, is not like on the forefront of things. And we're passing on all of these adaptations and the way that we learn to survive and the way that we were taught how to raise our children, and the way that we were taught about how to look and think about ourselves, right? We're passing these on one generation after another, and then we have all of these adaptations, and we're basically just in automatic repeating them one cycle after another. And it isn't until someone becomes aware of this that starts challenging, even if it's certain aspects of these cycles, that's when you see changes from one generation to the next. And that's when you see that these genetic adaptations might no longer be needed.
Yeah.
If you have a child who's predisposed to anxiety because they have that genetic predisposition, but they grow up in a very safe environment, that child will still more than likely be anxious, but you will create that safety for them, which will make it so that their the adaptations don't have to be turned on all the time.
Yeah.
And hopefully you start breaking that in like whether it's for their children or generations after them, those genetic tags no longer have to be passed on because they're no longer needed. Like people don't need them to be safe because they're no longer living in that environment.
Thank you for putting it again very eloquently. The thought I had as you were talking which may sound bad, but it's what I was thinking about was like breeding animals, like dog breeding, for example. A lot of dog and cat, and even, just various animal breeds were created in the 80s, just, for a certain look or a certain feature. And a lot of times, people will breed animals for a specific feature that they want them to have. Like, for example, the cats with the short legs, or dogs with extremely long legs or with shorter ears, or, just something like that. And so people will crossbreed animals and plants or whatever to get a certain look. And it's the reason why that came to me, because you were talking about how, parents raise children or they have these children, and going back, if you go back to slave days or other days, you know, people were bred. People were bred to have specific features or bred for specific duties. If we're talking about days, were bred for, they were bred to be strong, they were bred to be athletic, or they were bred to be in the house, or, so very similar to animals. And I don't like to put people in that category of being animal like, or, being bred for a purpose. But the reality is a lot of people are. But it also makes sense that what you're saying is true, because a lot of the physical features that people, animals, or plants, or whatever are bred to have, why wouldn't the mental health stuff, right? Which we think of as mental health. Why wouldn't the mental stuff also be passed on, just like those physical traits?
Absolutely. And I think it's so powerful that, when people talk about like, well, the past is in the past, or this happened so many years ago. No, like, let me give you an example. Let's say that I am the most loving, present, attuned, safe mom, and I have a really safe environment. Not saying perfect, but like very safe, nurturing, and loving.
Mm,
And then there's another mom who's suffering domestic violence, and her survival mechanism is always on because she has to make sure that she makes it to the next day. Who do you think is going to be able to connect more to their children? And what is the impact of those
that's
children?
true too.
How are those children going to parent from those experiences that they've had differently?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that some people say, well, I am nothing like my parent. Yeah, but that we change things about who our parents were with us doesn't mean that we know what healthy looks like,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm,
And
yeah.
so if we don't know how healthy looks like because we don't have a pattern of what healthy looks like, how do we learn it? It's
Mm,
not by intuition, like many people. I grew up believing that because they said, like, it's just so intuitive. It's intuitive based on your programming.
I
Whatever
agree.
programming you have, it's going to show up in your parenting.
Sure.
And so if we think about these scenarios, now put these into perspective 100, 200 years ago, okay? Let's just go up back 100 years, put that into perspective. So then you have somebody who grows up not knowing if they're going to survive the next day, you know, trying to make sure that their children survive, whatever the situation is. That nervous system is focused on surviving, not on connecting,
Mm,
right? And so that is such a big thing because this is what is passed on from one generation to the next. And don't
mm,
get me wrong, Like I may like raise my child in a super loving home, and then something very big happens to them that really shakes them
Yeah.
to the core, and now they have a new or different perspective of what safety is, and
Mhm.
not just a traumatic event, like maybe even something like what is happening, you know, in other places around the world where they're losing like their democracy, like they were used to a certain life and now they're not. And obviously you have those shifts, you know,
Mhm.
that impact future generations. And this is just a part of the world, and this is just a part like of things that happen, you know, consistently, that create big shifts in the way that people parent, but we can't ignore that this is a reality. And that, you know, like in my Hispanic community, a lot of us have been raised with what Leslie from Latinx parenting always says, the chancla culture, you know, like we excuse abuse to children, you know, because we feel that children who are controlled and comply with what you say are considered the good children, and if they disobey, they deserve physical punishments. And
Mhm.
how is that not impacting our children, right? And the way that they see themselves, the way that they feel in their body, their nervous system, their ability to connect with their parents, because you're connecting with somebody who's also creating fear, right?
Mm.
And a lot of these methods, you know, I've heard this conversation that a lot of these methods come from colonization, right? And so
Mm.
I, yeah, I think this conversation is so complex and
Yes.
layered, right? That I wish that it was just black and white, and that if we said like, oh, if you do X, Y, and Z and read this parenting book, then you're gonna be like a good mom, and that's that. And that's simply not how it works.
Yeah, I think it's complex, but I think it's awesome I think it's complexity in an awesome way because it challenges us to think about abuse, oppression, trauma in a different way. And it's very interesting to, you know, I was having another thought while you were talking. And, you're talking about basically, you know, being raised in a survivalist home. And so that when you become a parent, you're parenting, you're basically doing some trauma-based parenting, meaning that you're parenting from a traumatically filled place. And so the fear that we instill in children, those are things that come from a trauma filled place. And I think that's something that's important to say because um, abuse is not black and white, as you said. But I also think it's important to note that because you do have people, at least I do, I have clients that come to me all the time. I have this relationship with my mother, or I have this relationship with my father. And when I grew up, and became when I thought when I grew up and became an adult, I said to myself, I no longer wanted to be like that person. I'm going to make damn sure that I'm not like that person. I'm going to make sure that I don't raise my children like I was raised. And I see usually one of two things: the exact same behaviors, right? Which they become very frustrated and they can see it too. And they hate that about themselves. Like I said that, but something's not working and the mechanism doesn't translate for me to stop, even though in my mind, I know that I should stop. Or two, I see someone that is a radical opposite that tries to overcompensate. Very it's very rare that I see someone that's at a happy medium unless they've done a significant amount of work to do that. And so I think that's why it's important. And I think, it's also important to know that oftentimes people, not all the time, there's a few exceptional cases, but most of the time, people that are abusive come from abusive environments.
Mhm.
And I think there's a part of having to understand that, because a lot of times abusers get demonized. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any strong emotion. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but there's usually very little digging into, the brain work, to the background, or there's very little credit given to that. It's just like, oh, well. And while I think that genetics and what you're talking about is very important, let me ask you this, because it's almost like a chicken or the egg question. How much responsibility or how much fault should we lay at what you're talking about, being raised, the genetics versus the person? Because although you have this genetic predisposition, or you have, this is a long lineage, at what point do we say, or is it really feasible to say, that you should be responsible for your own actions?
I think it's both. I think it's so I don't okay, so let me rephrase this. Like, I think for me, it's important to understand your past, to understand yourself
Mm-hmm.
and why you react the way that you do, you think the way that you behave the way that you do automatically, right? And also, as an adult, you are responsible for how you show up in the world and in your relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you don't want to address the things that are going on with you, I'm not saying you, I'm just saying
Oh,
in
no,
general.
no, no. I'm listening. Yeah, I'm like, oh, it's so intriguing. No.
So this is my perspective of things.
Yeah.
Like, if you feel like, you know what, I don't want to go to therapy, I don't want to change that, like, this is who I am and people
Yes.
have to accept me. So if you are in that sense and you are by yourself and you endure the consequences of your actions, then I think, like, it's your choice whether you want to change or not. It doesn't mean that it's not your responsibility though, but it's your choice. It's still your choice, right? Now, if you are with human beings, like, we are in community with other people. So if you are interacting with other people and you're harming other people because of your programming, then it's on you, because you know that you have a problem, and in this problem you're harming other people, and you're making the choice to not find a way around this.
Mm.
And I think at some point, I honestly, it's not, I don't want to sound like I'm giving people a pass, but I feel like there wasn't a lot of information around mental health. And obviously I'm talking about the United States. I think some developed countries have a bigger, like, wider grasp on mental health, but I also want to acknowledge that this is not the reality for every country.
Yeah.
And so mental health information is not accessible to everyone. So some people are automatic. And because the society that they live in supports that, sometimes abuse is supported, right? And so, and the ideas are reinforced and excused, right? The behaviors. So in that sense, I feel like, I'm not saying parents were not responsible for changing, but I'm just saying that it can be really hard to change when, one, like, the information is not accessible, you're not aware of what's happening, and then the society that you live in actually reinforces that behavior, So I think that, again, it's not black and white. There's just so much gray to it. But then, does that mean that that you're not responsible for the harm that you caused,
Yeah.
well, your children will tell you about it, right? So how do they feel about that? And what is that? How are they making sense of this? Again, I feel like whenever we have these conversations, it's just so complex because for some people, they understand that their parents did the best that they could with the tools that they had.
Yeah.
And then other people had extremely abusive parents,
Yeah.
and they will never accept that the level of harm that they caused was the best that they could do, you know? So,
Yeah. And, as you were talking, several thoughts came to my mind. I think when it comes to people, society is less compassionate. And when I say people, I mean, people versus animals. So for example, if we're talking about, animals again, there are certain dogs that are bred to be aggressive, right? Like for canine units or what have you, for example, a German Shepherd. Now, let's say that German Shepherd bites someone that he's not supposed to bite. We're a lot more forgiving and willing to accept that behavior from a dog now versus people. We're not willing to say that that's a problem or that that's something that we need to work on together as a community. It's more like that person is demonized. And again, I'm not saying in every case that that's not warranted or that that's not acceptable, but a lot of times, when people are demonized for making a mistake or for acting out, they don't get help. They're not taught. No one from the community steps in and say, hey, let me take hold of this child that's growing up in this chaotic environment. Let me teach them another way. We sort of ostracize and keep them there or put them away in, penitentiaries or other places like that. And so I feel like it's warranted to take another look at it. And it's good that you and I are having this conversation. And I guess I say all that to say, I know that was very long-winded and chatty. As a society, as a community, what is our responsibility?
that is a very good question. I think in every area, whether it's parenting or the judicial system, the educational system, just like you're saying, like whatever we don't have the tools to help people work through, it's just too hard. And so it's just easier to blame instead of trying to understand, you know? And I think this is why we need to have more conversations about the impact of mental health and more awareness so that we begin as a community making these connections. To be very honest, like I know that some people don't like the use of the word trauma too much or narcissist, and I get this. And at the same time, I'm not bothered by these conversations because we were not having them. And so I 100% much rather someone believe that they might have trauma or believe that they might be narcissists or have narcissistic personality disorder and go seek help and then have a professional, walk them through their concerns than simply to not have these conversations at all. And I think that as we're learning, we need space to have these conversations, and we're not going to get it right, but hopefully 100 years from now, we'll look back and we'll look at how silly we all look trying to figure out how it was to have these conversations about the things that we often didn't talk about before, which are like all the symptoms, right? So that's my hope. But then back to kind of like what you were saying, I remember I used to work at high school, and I remember some of the counselors would be very upset that students were not responsible, right? Like they were truant, they weren't turning in their homework, and I just like, it bugged me because I was like, when did the adults stop being responsible? For a teenager to behave in the way that they do, they don't wake up one day, right? And suddenly, unless like there's a big change in their life, right? Have these big changes in the way that they behave. And when you see a child, sometimes you just place the focus on the child, but a lot of times you want to look at the home environment. So at what age do we start making somebody, I don't want to use the word responsible, but at what age do we stop trying to understand what happened, right? And just focus on the problem and blaming someone for what is happening. And when I work with parents and I do parenting, this is the main thing that I talk about, because children are the result of their environment, unless obviously developmentally there's something going on. But if we look at things from the lens of trying to solve and not understand, then we're missing the mark. And that is in anything, right? And I think that we do that a lot. And I think that as a community, it is our role to start asking more questions, try to understand more instead of just labeling something, which is also why I'm so glad that social media exists, because I think that we are beginning to challenge a lot of thoughts around different things, I learned so much from other professionals who are really challenging, and the way that we view things, the way that we view laziness or relationship problems or or procrastination. I just love that information is getting out there, and we're moving from labeling thing as like, oh, somebody's very shy or somebody's very unmotivated, and we're actually trying to understand more. And I just think that needs to happen more. And I'm hoping that, we're paving the way for things to continue.
I hope so too. And it's one of the reasons why I do this podcast, to have those discussions, to actually be proactive in one area in terms of having these discussions and stopping the cycle of abuse, which, it sounds so very cliche. But as you said, a lot of people are they have the notion that, why can't you just stop abusing? And this is one of the reasons why I'm so very glad that I have this podcast, because you've giving such a refreshing take on it, that there's so many layers on why we can't stop or why this isn't slowing down. There's the community or society standpoint. There's the family, the environment standpoint. There's the biological component. There's so many different elements. And again, as you say, we're just starting the conversation, and there's so many different complexities. And then not to mention, from the abuser and the survivor standpoint, it's not just abusers are wired to be a certain way, but as you brought up, survivors may be brought up to be very complacent, to be very, just sort of, oh, so there's all these kind of things. And this is why it can't stop, because while I talk to a variety of people that have different perspectives, it just goes to show you how diverse our world is and what we believe and what we experience and how we apply that.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for sharing your perspective on that, because I think it's been very refreshing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. I honestly just love talking about this. I think it's so important to have these conversations.
Mhm.
And I think, we're beginning to understand more and more that simple solutions to very complex problems take more than just, tools and positive thoughts. And I think it's also so
Yes.
important to understand the fight-flight mechanism in our brain and how the logical part of our brain is shut down, right? When we are on fight-flight, when we're in survival mode,
Mm.
because a lot of the times when people feel very stuck, a lot of times people can know logically that they want to react or, think differently, and they can't figure out why. And it's based on their programming and their survival mechanism
Yeah.
and their logical part of the brain, like the logical part of the brain being shut down when they're in survival.
Mm.
Because survival doesn't care about your logic, and your logic
Yeah.
just gets in the way
Mhm.
sometimes of the work that it's trying to do, which is protect you, right? And I know that might not make sense to some people when it comes to people who are abusing, but if we break down the wiring of somebody who is abusive and how they view abuse and how their protective mechanism is wired, right? Then we might have a better understanding of how that comes about,
Mm.
and um, again, it's not an excuse, it's an explanation for how things happen. And it's important to understand how things happen, because if
Yes.
not, we're never really going to find an answer of how to do better.
Yeah.
And if telling people to not do things had worked, we wouldn't have the problems that we had now.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of suffering in families and communities, in entire cultures, right? And it's not so easy as just telling people to stop doing something.
That's very true. Very true. Well, thank you for sharing that. And we are at the end. It went so fast. So, Yolanda, can you tell people how to find you and if there's something that you're working on that we can support you with?
Oh, thank you.
Mm.
Well, I have an Instagram account. This is Yolanda Renteria. I have a TikTok account.
What? You're on TikTok? I need to follow you.
Yes, I started. I do. I have some videos in Spanish too, because my community has asked for content in
Nice.
Spanish.
Nice.
So English and Spanish. And this is Yolanda Renteria. It's my handle. I am doing some somatic work for people who are interested in doing somatic processing. And yeah, I have surprises coming, but I can't talk about it just.
Not a problem. I respect that. I respect that. But if you want some support in the future, please let us know.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for sharing all this wonderful wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for listening. Tell me what you thought about my conversation with Yolanda and what your thoughts are on what we had to say about all the contributors to abuse. And whether or not you believe it, you don't believe it, you support it, you have some suggestions on how us as a society can, pull together and rectify it. So, love to know what your thoughts are. And until next time, thank you so much and be well and be good to yourselves.